Okay, if I can have everybody sit down, we'll get started. We're a little bit limited on time, considering the number of people we have around the table. We have allocated an hour's worth of time, and we plan to go about 40 minutes here at the front of the room, and then allow for a good 20 minutes of questioning from the floor as well, because I know there's a great deal of interest. Not to be cheeky about it, but at one point I thought I was going to invite some of the religious leaders to come in and give the last rites to the Doha round at 16:45. And I didn't want to start taking sides of Greek Orthodox. I thought, should I reach out to a Catholic or one of the imams that are here? But you guys pulled it together after a 3-hour meeting, it looks like. It's great to have everybody around the table. As you can see, we're bringing together players from Europe, Far East Asia, South Asia, the United States, Latin America, and of course the WTO itself. But I think we need to put it into context. This is one of those good Davos moments where things could have gone horribly wrong. But you had a consensus building beforehand, meetings taking place in Washington, in Delhi, in Brussels, many bilaterals, and then the weight of having 30 ministers here in Davos to sit around the table and have bilateral meetings on the side. I walked out 15 minutes ago, and there was a bilateral between the Brazilians and the Japanese. So the meetings continue to go on as we speak, which is a very positive sign. But we can't get overly enthusiastic because of the complexities of politics and the convergence with economics. A lot's been done today, but we're going to find out over the next hour the real hard work that needs to be done in the next 4 to 6 months. But the International Business Council, the World Economic Forum weighing in at a very crucial time. Heads of state from Europe, the United States, Africa weighing in at the right time to build a momentum to get the Doha perhaps back on track. I think in the essence of protocol, I'm going to call on our host minister, Ms. Leuthard, to give us a quick summary of what was trying to be accomplished over the last couple of days. What was the objective to try to bring everybody together here in Davos, and what was accomplished so far, and then I'll open it up to roundtable discussion. Doris?
Yes, thank you. Does it work? Okay. Thank you very much. Well, for Switzerland, it was a good opportunity here in Davos, bringing together all the important ministers and getting back on track the Doha round. You know, since last June, the trade negotiations didn't start anymore. In mid-November, we had some technical works which continued, but on ministerial level, it was actually the first informal meeting we could have here in Davos. And it was together very important that they talked with each other, because they have many bilateral meetings in different groups. This was good, but we needed today also some transparency to know from the US, from the European Union, from India, Brazil, the major players, what are the problems, what is your position, how could we get back on track the official former negotiations. Secondly, we wanted also to discuss, is it important just to discuss about agriculture and NAMA, or should, where we want to get a win-win situation for everybody with all the different interests we have from member states, we have to get a fully fledged negotiation round, so we also have to get on track negotiations on services, on rules in general, in all the sectors which belong to the Doha round. And one thing was also important. It was constructed at the beginning as Doha development round. So it's not only about trade, it also has to aim for better life for everybody, better life for developing countries who need more support of us. But this is one thing which is crucial to concretize. So I'm quite happy today they met. They will meet also in the future in groups and bilateral, multilateral level. But at the end, we have to multilateralize all the discussions. We have to get the Doha round not only get back on track, but to concrete results in tariff structures, in market access, in real results for trade flow.
Thank you very much. I remember covering the Uruguay round until the final gavel went down in 1993, and there wasn't a lot of global attention back then on the GATT body as it was. And there's a tendency for the WTO to now be linked very closely to globalization, and Ernesto Cedillo had said during one of the discussions we had here that we're not selling the merits of globalization perhaps the way we should. I'd like to ask the Director General, is this an opportunity now to convey a message that globalization can, as the Minister just talked about, really be a development round? And if I can get into the subtleties of the things that came out after your meetings today, resuming talks but no specific timetable, full negotiations mode in Geneva, but this is not at ministerial level. And it sounds like it's arcane, but there is a big difference here. Can you start us on how quickly we're going to go into negotiations and why we did not go to ministerial level?
Well, answering your first question, it's all fine making speeches that globalization can work better for developing countries. We all are convinced of this, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Developing countries want this negotiation to land into results that offer them more opportunities than before to integrate through trade into globalization. And until and unless we get there, there will remain some suspicions that this is only for Sunday speeches, but that people behave differently on Mondays. On your second point, what I heard here in Davos before this morning was it must be done, and this is the sort of very unambiguous message which Angela Merkel, President Lula, Thabo Mbeki, Tony Blair gave. And second, that it can be done. Of course, when I say it's doable, each of these very clever negotiators will say, ooh, it's doable, but, or if. Now, I remain of the view that it is doable. What we got this morning was a message that the momentum was there, that we are switching, or we have to be prepared to switch from this, flying mode in circles above the landing zone, which we've been doing for some time, to the sort of switching to the approach mode. And you switch to the approach mode when you got a signal from the control tower that the landing zone is available. Now, what I've been entrusted with is a sort of making a judgment on when switching to this, which will materialize by ministers being reconvened in Geneva, is there. Now, I will not do that tomorrow, because I know that there are still a lot of bilateral, quiet, silent contacts and diplomacy that has to take place in order to test the numbers in terms which are understandable for the constituencies. And this is not WTO jargon. But we need the trade ministers to be the translators between what their constituencies understand and the sort of rules which we then adopt in WTO. It's not going to be tomorrow, but we also know that there is a process on the US side which relates to the expiry of Trade Promotion Authority, which is the authorization which Congress has, and I'm briefed us on that. And I know that I can't wait too long. So it's going to be for me to make a judgment. If I do it too soon, they won't be ready. If I do it only if I'm sure they have pre-agreed bilaterally, it might be never. So, just try and sit in my boots. Not an easy call to make. Final point. You're all pushing on the people who are here. And I would like a minute to try and convince you that you have to help them. Each of these people on this table has difficult domestic constituency problems. They genuinely all want this round to happen. They have to do the political traction vis-à-vis various interest groups, and this is perfectly legitimate in parliaments with constituencies. Their big bosses have told us that they were ready to spend a bit of their political capital on this. This is good news, and mind you, it's very important for each of them. But you here can also help. Think of what you can do in order to help them convincing their constituencies at the end of the day. It won't happen by a decree of God. It will happen if this complex political game does take place. I repeat, it's doable, and I think this morning's meeting has put quite a lot of energy with this notion that the landing zone is approaching.
Thank you very much. The political realities are quite difficult, and you touched upon them there, Director General. One of them is we have French elections in April, so it's very hard to build a consensus on tariff reductions with that looming. Chancellor Merkel made quite a strong plea to get the Doha round back on track. I'm sure she would like to host the G8 summit with a Doha round complete, and these are not insignificant things. But at the same time, fast-track authority finishes June 30th. If it doesn't look very appealing in the U.S. Congress or to the U.S. Congress, that extension probably will not be granted. So if I can go to the U.S. Trade Representative, do you really see that you have now at the end of January to say May to get this really nailed down so you can go to Congress, which is not so open as it used to be in terms of extending fast-track authority? We even heard here in Davos in the hallways, to get something concrete on the table and complete in your view?
I think fast-track authority, as you know, will be necessary for the United States to implement a Doha round agreement. I think it's quite clear that trade promotion authority, fast-track authority, is more likely to move through a United States Congress that has a sense of what it's going to be used for. And therefore, a breakthrough in the Doha round, a breakthrough across sectors where constituencies can then go to their elected representatives and say, we want this outcome in agriculture, we want this new market access, we want the services, manufacturing, development outcomes. That gives it real meaning. That makes it tangible. And I think the significance of the process that we've embarked on in the last several weeks and months, and that was embraced today by a critical group of WTO members, is that it is pragmatic, that it is practical, and that it can provide real meaning to constituencies and politicians. And I'll give you just a specific example. A lot of you have heard us use all this WTO speak. And if you are a manufacturer being told that some country is going to embrace a NAMA coefficient, Swiss coefficient of 13, isn't going to mean a whole lot in terms of your P&L outcome. Or if you are a poultry producer and you're told that somebody's going to have an average tariff cut of 52 or 54, that doesn't mean anything unless you know what tariff cut your product's going to get and or what kind of tariff rate quota or quantity you're going to be able to get in the market. Well, we're starting to talk about those specifics. We tried talking all the headline numbers, and the talks broke down over the headline numbers. We don't have convergence on that. But this combination of focusing on sensitivities, real red lines, focusing on priorities, and then reverse integrating into the numbers that will ultimately govern the implementation, provides a framework where we could get a breakthrough. And if we get a breakthrough, it is a breakthrough that constituencies will understand and convey to their members of Congress and say, hey, let's extend fast track because we really want this Doha round to become law.
Okay, I'd like to come back to the headline numbers a little bit later if we have the time to do so. But I'd like to turn to Minister Nath and ask his opinion. And I think it's worth recognizing that with the ever-increasing power of the G20 and the shift in power around the world to some of these emerging economies today, that the WTO is much more inclusive but much more complex. You have negotiations between the developed and developing almost on par. So from the time that I was covering the Uruguay round, it wasn't quite that way. So I put that in the background for you to add some context. You're living, Minister Nath, by the realities of fast-track authority. You're living in the realities of the French elections, living in the realities of people who are not too willing to cut down tariffs substantially to give Commissioner Mandelson a lot of wiggle room, and Congressman saying that the Farm Bill is not going to be a lot different than the last one went through with subsidies of $20 billion. You don't have a lot of leeway yourself. What's it like to try to negotiate at the table with the political realities of the West right now and the worries about globalization?
Well, in the morning today, we've been able to, despite the freeze outside, deep freeze the talks which were frozen. And this is with the optimism. It's with renewed optimism and renewed commitment. And once the process starts, as Pascal rightly said, and I think that's the important thing to note, is that the numbers have to be tested, which are going to happen bilaterally. They're going to happen in groups. And until those numbers are tested, well, we can't assess progress. But let me make one thing very clear. Nothing, and I made this clear in the morning, that I'm not driven, none of this resumption or process is driven by fast track or by the Farm Bill. It's driven because we want to have it. And I said this very clearly today in the meeting, and I want to reiterate it, that it's being driven because we believe that the rule-based multilateral system, as India, where India is concerned, as India becomes more and more globally competitive, the rule-based multilateral system is as important to India as it is important to the United States or the European Union. And the content of this round is as important as the completion of this round. We can't have completion overriding content or timelines overriding content. But that doesn't mean, so my message should not, what I'm saying should not mean that there are the rigidities, we are rigid on certain things. I'm not. I'm very clear that we have to move on. This process starts an engagement which was not there from July. Of course, we continued with our bilateral consultations, inching, sometimes trying to understand each other's sensitivities, because we've talked for many months on agriculture. Today, rightly so, we said that, okay, we are going to bring in industrial products, we're going to bring in services, we're going to bring in rules, because rules is the most important part of the multilateral trading system. And once conceptually, and I think these 7 months has given us a sense of each other's perceptions, apprehensions, and this comprehension is very important to move forward.
Good. Commissioner Mandelson, agriculture trade, if I've got my numbers correct, take up about 8% of global trade today, and it seems to take up about 80% of the conversation around the table, at least what we're digesting out of press conferences and the negotiations going through on the newspapers and on electronic media. Do you want to jump in and tell us the realities of why agriculture trade has taken up so much time, and then move, if you can, to the concrete steps or the concrete numbers that are on the table? You had outlined some before you came to Davos, the progress that's been made over the last couple of days.
Because although agriculture does not represent huge amounts of world GDP, trade, and any other litany of statistics that you would care to identify, it is nonetheless a relatively important subject, because it has been subject to the least reform and treatment and restructuring in trade terms compared to manufactured goods. It's also important for a number of, not all, but a number of developing countries who are agriculturally competitive, and they want to find greater outlet for that competitiveness. By the same token, there are very many other, indeed many more developing countries who are rather more defensive about agriculture. They're not competitive. They're either much less competitive, or they have huge subsistence agricultural sectors which simply cannot take on the market access demands that are being voiced and insisted upon by those other developing countries and those in the developed world who are competitive. Now, why does it preoccupy us to such a great extent? Well, partly for the reasons I've just said, and because also it's very complex. It is really complex. I don't think in any public office I've had in my ministerial career, I've had to deal with a subject of such immense technical complexity as reforming farm trade and carrying through liberalisation in this sector. Now, having said that, I think we have done some disservice to development by becoming so trapped by agriculture in these talks. I think that we have turned a lot of people off the talks who would otherwise identify very strongly with what we're doing, who represent other economic interests in the global economy, who have felt, well, what's in this for me? I mean, it's all about agriculture, isn't it? Because that's all they hear about. You know, even though the benefits, the economic benefits from the round will come principally in liberalisation of services, but also not in market access at all, but in trade facilitation, stripping out the inefficiencies, the red tape, and the needless costs in actually doing trade. After that, the next highest number of economic gains from the successful completion of this round will be in manufactured goods. And frankly, every single analysis points to the fact that the agricultural gains are a poor fourth. But nonetheless, we have to strike the right balance in reforming and taking forward both improvements, sizable, substantial improvements in agricultural market access, and stripping out the trade distorting effects and impact of the subsidies that are used in the developed world by the European Union and by the United States. And I, for one, would consider it a huge and historic gain and step forward when we have bound into the WTO in an irreversible way the restructuring of agricultural support in the developed world and the elimination of its trade distorting impact. A huge and historic gain, but we have paid a price, there's no doubt at all about that, by being trapped in this subject so deeply and for so long.
If I can have a quick follow-up. After the French elections in April, can you move off of that target they said was not movable of 39%, the French, on the tariffs, and get it closer to what you seem to be putting on the table of 54%?
In the Commission, I have the competence given to me by the 27 member states to represent them and negotiate on their behalf in these world trade talks. They give me a mandate. I am not allowed to exceed my mandate, but nor do I have any intention of falling an inch short of that mandate and taking it to the very furthest point of the envelope I have, whether it be in agriculture or in any other sector of the negotiation. And if, as I gather has been the case this afternoon, a number of member states of the European Union have expressed some concern or some surprise by what I did this morning, all I would say on the one hand is, well, I can understand your concern because you see me constantly appearing to be offering more or more frequently than the others. But on the other hand, I say to them, if you don't want a successful outcome in these talks, we're not going to get anywhere by everyone simply sitting pat and sitting on their hands.
That's a very frank answer. Minister Amorim, I'd like to follow up with, after my question to Minister Nath, about the consensus building within the G20. We talked about the complexities of the U.S. system or the European Commission with the 27 member states. Do we have a consensus among the G20 now, with two large members sitting here on the forefront during this discussion, to move forward? Are there sticking points in market access, for example, that will prevent the G20 from coming as a group and sitting down and say, yes, in 2 or 3 months we can make this happen?
Well, please allow me to make some 2 or 3 comments before and some other things that were said. First, I think it's I'm an old hand from the old get, and a meeting like that with this audience would never take place. It was just irrelevant what Brazil or India might think. So this is already a big step forward. I miss an African here in this distinguished panel. I think it would be more complete. But in any case, I think the G20 has been, in a way, a work of very difficult and delicate diplomatic architecture. And I think it's true what several said. I think it was Peter who said lately that there are different situations, and some of our countries are very competitive in agriculture. It's true of Brazil, it's true of Argentina, it's true of others. It's not the same case exactly of India or some African countries. But what some people sometimes don't stress as much, I don't want to be unfair to them because I heard what Peter just said about subsidies, and I think that's very positive. But what people don't stress so much is that some of these countries are not competitive precisely because of the subsidies that the rich country give. So it is not as if India cannot become competitive once these agricultural subsidies are out, because it's not only what, this economy is not, it certainly is not a science, but it's not a static thing either, it's dynamic. So it's the expectation that you may become competitive in the future is that what may attract investment. And I give you just one example. In Brazil, it's a very famous example because it got to litigation and so on, and it's cotton. Brazil was a producer of cotton 50 years ago or so. I would read in the textbooks when I was a young child. Well, 60 years ago because I was a young child, literally. But anyway, then it disappeared. Then I was not dealing with the trade, and suddenly I discovered that Brazil had a case against the United States on cotton. Well, I don't want to go into that in detail, but it was precisely the notion that we might go into that direction, that subsidies might be dealt with and eliminated, that may revive our cotton industry. So I think I would be very cautious with this division between those countries that are defensive and those countries that are offensive. But even so, since we discovered those many things that we had in common, we were able to put together a coalition. Everyone who deals with politics knows that coalition doesn't mean absolute unanimity all the time. It's a coalition. The G20 is a coalition. And in this coalition, you can be sure Brazil and India are together strongly, as Tanzania, as South Africa that I see here, as Guatemala, which are very different countries altogether, but which have in common the fact that they're all negatively affected by the existence of subsidies, export subsidies, which were now apparently dealt with, and internal subsidies. And let me just say one word, because I don't want to take too much time. Agree with Kamal, rules are very important thing, but precisely what we want to have in agriculture now are rules. We don't have rules. We have a little bit of rules, and that's what allowed us to have cases against the U.S. and the European Union, but not enough rules. And that's why I believe that the conclusion of the round is so important. I was really encouraged today by the words I heard from Peter Mandelson and from Susan Schwab, and I was able to say for myself, for Brazil, that I'm ready, and I have the authority by my president to go into a room. If Pascal wants, throw away the key and leave us there until we have the concrete numbers, I'm prepared to do that today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow.
So this is a Geneva negotiation that starts, this evening? It doesn't, from Davos to Geneva we start? Is that the idea, CG?
Well, it's good to know that Celso is fully empowered by his boss. Because next time he will ask for a break in order to get instructions from President Lula, I will know that he's again preparing some sort of clever trick. And I'm sure he will do that. I mean, now,
all my clever tricks are in your favor.
But I mean, it's good. And I think, again, it is a reverberation of the fact that after these months of suspension, a number of people have realized that this is about more than trade. And what I hope is that in parliaments, where, again, the mandate is given in the European Council, in the European Union, where the mandate is given, this view that it is more than a few numbers, which, by the way, are win-win. The magic thing about trade negotiations is that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not like some negotiations where what I give, I lose, and what you give, you lose. We're building something which is more. And I think that, I hope that this notion that it is about more than trade will also sink into constituencies. We need that to happen. Otherwise, if we remain sort of locked into a few constituencies blocking the negotiators, is going to be very difficult. But the signals we've got from here and from the people around the table this morning, we are ready to do it.
Minister Amari, I'd like to pick up on what Mr. Lamy was just talking about, and that is there really isn't an option for failure because it's much bigger than a trade deal. I mean, you could obviously have a failure, but it would send such a negative signal to the business community and to consumers, for that matter, that globalization, in fact, wasn't a good idea. There hasn't been a failure since World War II on a trade round, which I think most people don't focus in on. What is Japan willing to give up? You said you recognize the importance of this trade round, how important it is as a signal. What is Japan willing to put on the table here to make sure we do secure a worthwhile development round?
Well, I'm very good at speaking Japanese, but I'm afraid I'm not very good at speaking English. Therefore, let me speak in Japanese, where I'm very good at. First of all, there are two similar names, Amari and Amorim. They sound very much alike, so if you could say Amari of Japan or Amorim of Brazil, I think it would be easier for the people to understand. Now, first of all, certainly Japan is committed to this round. What can Japan do for the successful conclusion of the round? I think there are many things that Japan can do, and this round is called the DDA, which is about development. In other words, all the member countries participating in the negotiation should gain something from the process. As the DG has already mentioned, this trade negotiation is not a zero-sum game. Some countries are going to lose, where other countries are going to win. This is not about DDA. Every country should gain benefit from this. But developing countries seems to be suspicious of it, and they are afraid that they are going to lose out in this process. And therefore, I think it is important for us to show the development benefits to developing countries in the round. And for LDCs, Japan has committed to the expansion of duty-free, quota-free treatment of the goods coming from LDCs, and we're going to submit the bill to the Japanese Parliament to enable it, so that we would also like to provide the capacity building to these LDCs and developing countries, so that they can have a better opportunity to market their products. And there are 16 countries in East Asia, in other words, 10 ASEAN member countries plus 6 in East Asia. And in order to promote economic partnership in these countries, ASEAN, like Singapore and Malaysia, have been growing very rapidly. And at the same time, in ASEAN, there are Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, these countries which are not as developed as Malaysia and Singapore. So there is a difference of the level of development among ASEAN countries, and we're trying to help to reduce such a disparity, and we're to elevate the level of developing of less developed countries in ASEAN. We have been proposing to these countries for the better development of these countries, and we are promoting the establishment of think tank organizations in the East Asian region, and we have received the support of the countries in the region for this establishment. And this organization will engage in studies to identify the problems in the region and to propose the solutions to such problems. Japan will provide financial means and know-how to this organization so that this organization can engage in studies and surveys, and that would help build the strong economic capital and capability of these countries in the East region. And I think the trade negotiation should be a win-win game and not a zero-sum game. And I think this is through this sort of effort in the region that we would let the people understand this.
Good. Thank you very much. Madam Minister, I'd like to turn to you, if I may, and one of the points that you singled out in an email ahead of time was belief in the multilateral system. Now, 60% of all trade in the world now is kind of covered off by either a regional agreement or a bilateral agreement, even what Minister Amari was talking about in terms of the development of the East Asia trade zone. Is there a sound foundation and belief still in the WTO in multilateralism as opposed to the surge? And if you've looked at the charts, it's been almost like this the last 3 years in the creation of bilateral and regional agreements, the belief in multilateralism.
You're absolutely right. Since last June, we had an increasing number of FTAs on bilateral agreements got out, and everybody talks about, well, bilateral meetings are important, free trade is important. Well, it exists, but I think today every minister on this round here in Davos agreed that it's the second best way. It's a complementary on multilateral system because for our companies, when they have just a real full of spaghetti ball of different FTAs with different contents, everybody has to get a staff of people getting to know what's in there. It makes trade very complicated. It makes for companies, it makes it not easier, it makes it even worse. So we think we have to do both. Now, up till we have a result in the Doha round, we will continue to have more FTAs, but we will have to do it in a manner that we are able to multilateralize them. So with rules that we also can have in the system of WTO, because everybody knows the multilateral system gets us more security, more elimination of discrimination, because FTAs are in favor of OECD countries, are in favor of industrialized countries, but the poorest country, they don't profit from them. So if we really want to help the world trade system and benefit for everybody, then we have really to focus on the multilateral system, but complementary, try on bilateral ways, on FTAs, going the path for everybody, because it takes time, it takes a lot of rules, a lot of countries have to do their internal laws, have to learn how we can protect intellectual property. It's not easy to do this, so I think we can also help them to find rules and regulation systems which are respected, and only when we have rules which are respected from the countries, from companies, we really have fair trade.
Okay. Minister Amorim?
Well, I just would like to say that I absolutely agree with what Doris just said. And it's interesting because she comes from a rich, small country. I come from a big, poor country. And you can see that from different angles we have exactly the same notion. I would just add to the arguments that were given. First, I think these statistics sometimes are a bit illusory because many of these regional agreements were not primarily moved by trade interests. Trade was rather an instrument. I think surely that was the case inside the European Union itself. It was a political movement that had to do with the post-war reconstruction of Europe. I don't want to go into that. This similar thing happens in South America, for instance, in which we are doing an integration moved by our need to integrate, and that, of course, has commercial consequences. But it's a bit an illusion to put all these figures together. But I would also to add two arguments. or in a way, it's a development of the arguments that Doris just presented. First is the question of balance. It's much more likely to have a balanced agreement it's not easy, but it's much more likely to have a balanced agreement in a forum like this than in any agreement that, for instance, a country like Brazil would be involved with a developed country. That's no doubt. Here we have there's more equilibrium. That's already something important. I would say, quite honestly, and sometimes I have to say that to our own constituencies in Brazil, we would never actually have the possibility of raising a case like the case of cotton against the United States or the case of sugar against the European Union if it were in bilateral agreements. Okay, that would never happen. It's only the WTO that happens. And so that gives this kind of... and finally, I would just make someone emphasize the aspect of rules. I think if you're looking for rules... these rules have to be multilateral. I can't have a rule on intellectual property that applies to the United States and a different one that applies to Switzerland, because I don't have an agreement with Switzerland and I have one with the United States, or vice versa. And of course, subsidies. A lot of our discussions in the free trade area of the Americas and also in the European Union, Mercosur in the beginning, were centered on subsidies. And of course, we couldn't go anywhere because, of course, the United States would not, let us say, unilaterally disarm where the European Union was not doing the same thing, or Japan, or whatever. So there are things that we can only deal with in the multilateral system. And these are things, some of which benefit developing countries, some might benefit developed ones. But I think the WTO may be bad, may be imperfect, but it's irreplaceable.
Okay, good. I'm going to go to Ambassador Schwab and then Director General Lamy, and then open the floor to questions. If I can ask you to keep it brief because of the time limit we have, Ambassador.
Just on the issue of multilateral versus bilateral, I think there's a general consensus that if you're looking for to promote global economic growth and development, a multilateral system, a multilateral trade agreement is critical. It is critical, however, presuming that the negotiations don't reach some lowest common denominator solution or some lowest common denominator deal that doesn't generate new trade flows. So when we're talking about a breakthrough and we're talking about whether it's agriculture or manufacturing or services, unless and until we have a breakthrough and the makings of a deal that genuinely create new trade flows, it's going to be hard to argue to constituencies that somehow you are supplanting the benefits of a bilateral system. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have, is the credibility of the multilateral system to get beyond a lowest common denominator decision into something that is ambitious and balanced.
Just very quickly, if I can follow up, there seems to be a disconnect, though, within G8 constituencies, and I'm American, so I'll say it about the Americans. 1/6 of the world lives on less than $1 a day. If they don't see them, we don't understand the merits and the connection between the Doha round and getting these people out of the poverty ranks. And this is something I'm very surprised that Congress is not doing.
Well, forgive me, having spent 10 years in academia before coming back into government, you put on your academic hat and you take Economics 101 and you discover that a lot of the things we're talking about doing in terms of disciplining subsidies, in terms of eliminating subsidies, in terms of lowering trade barriers, we probably should be doing unilaterally. I mean, if you want the economic development benefit, we should be doing them unilaterally. We shouldn't be waiting for somebody else to do it as a reciprocal matter. As it turns out, for political reasons, and because you can have a real multiplier effect doing this on a multilateral basis, we turn to an institution like the WTO and previously the GATT to get a bigger bang for the buck and to be able to do politically in the context of a trade agreement what we should probably be doing unilaterally.
Okay, I'll come back to you, Minister Knapp, but Mr. Lamy.
Yeah. Very, very shortly on this bilateral and multilateral. Remember, the political purpose of this round is to rebalance the system in favor of developing countries. Not that developed countries will not get a plus. They will get a plus, not least because they are more competitive on the world markets. But if you remember that, please look at this bilateral and multilateral from the point of view of developing countries. It's about tariffs and it's about rules. That's what trade negotiations are about. Tariff-wise, bilaterals can bring something to me, a developing country? Not much. Not least because in most of the cases I already have preferences on the big rich markets like US, EU, Japan. So the differential is small. What I don't get from a bilateral is the big part of the negotiation for me, which is the rules, which is the discipline. Celso said it. You do not have, subsidy-wise, a bilateral chicken and a multilateral chicken. Fisheries-wise, you do not have a bilateral fish and a multilateral fish. The subsidies goes to all fishers, or all fishermen, to be more precise. So that's where the profound inequality of saying, well, we decided we would have this round for this purpose. Now, we can't do it. Let's go bilateral. It's just a negation of what we decided at the original round. So you're totally changing the purpose of the thing. And I think developing countries are watching this very, very closely.
Good. Mr. Nath, you're a developing country?
Well, the WTO provides for bilateral agreements. And as I said right at the onset, it's the rules. You can't have different rules. You can't have a bilateral, multilateral rules. But all bilateral and regional agreements are WTO plus, are supposed to be WTO plus. That's the important thing to remember. And while they do not replace this, they cannot possibly replace the multilateral system because there's rules, there's subsidies, and rightly said, you can't do it for one and not do it for the other. But it's a fact of life that we have the NAFTA, we have the CAFTA, just in the United States 1.5 years ago. President Bush is talking of an AFTA. We have the European Union and so on and so forth, maybe dictated by other reasons. So there has been this tendency in the last 1 year, this criticism, when countries in Asia, like I remember when India started entering into some trade agreements, everybody was saying, why is India doing it? I said, listen, you've done it for the last 10 years. You've been doing this all throughout. And what dictates these agreements? Regional geography dictates it. Regional equations dictate it. We have a preferential trade agreement with Mercosur, right across the other part of the world. That doesn't mean there's nothing going to come about it, and that doesn't mean that the WTO system is now going to collapse, because it just can't collapse. But I want to, before I finish, just say one thing, because I want to flag that, what Pascal said, that what does this round seek to do? Well, we moved away. I think we're getting immersed in regional, and we should really be talking about multilateral. I think what we need to flag is what Pascal said, that this round seeks to rebalance trade in favor of developing countries. Once we flag that, I think we are on with it.
Good. Let's open the floor for questions for a good 10 minutes if we can. We have Jean-Pierre Lerman from the Evian Group, if we can take a microphone there, and we'll come around thereafter, yeah? And if I can ask, because of the time limit, Jean-Paul, just to direct the question to somebody.
Yeah, my question is directed to the Japanese minister, Mr. Amari, because, John, I don't know if you realize it, but he didn't answer your question.
Okay, I did realize that.
And so basically, I'm asking the same question that John Dexterios asked. What is Japan prepared to do and to give in terms of commitment to this particular round? Not what it's doing in ASEAN and setting up think tanks and so on and so forth. I'm talking about actual sort of concrete steps that Japan is prepared to do. Just perhaps something Pascal Lamy also said, that it's more than about trade. Given the region that you're living in, can you tell us something about Japanese perceptions on trade and security in the East Asia region? But first, most important is the question that John Dexterios asked you.
Well, this is about development, DDA, development agenda. So the question was what we can do in this development round.
Yes, specifically, and this is actually something that you passed on to notes, so I don't mean to harbor on it, but I do like to get an answer on it. what is Japan specifically in terms of market access willing to do to see the completion of the round? We heard from Commissioner Mandelson and Ambassador Schwab. Specific measures, because you said failure is not an option. What do you want to put on the table here?
Well, about the market access, about tariffs, in the Inama manufactured products, we have the lowest tariff rate in the world at this moment. And I think the problem is about agriculture for Japan. And concerning this agriculture, this is not the place for negotiation, so I cannot give you specific numbers. I'm not in a position to be able to do this today. But the basic position of our country is that we would, of course, take an offensive where we can do that, and where we have to defend, we will defend, and where we think we can make a concession, we will do so. There are things that we have to defend, which is tariff capping and the sensitive products. To what extent we can keep them. But other than these, I'm not the responsible minister for agriculture, but for others, we are willing to make concessions, and we have made it clear in the negotiating table. And when it comes to specifics, what sort of percentage we can reduce and so forth is something that we can only say in the negotiating table. This is not the place for negotiation. As the specific negotiation would move forward, it's not just Japan which is going to make that sort of concessions on the table. We have to think about the domestic support, how it can be reduced, and there are many other things concerning agriculture, NAMA, and there are other areas, including services, anti-dumping rules, and other rules and services. I think these 6 areas should move forward as a package. Therefore, I think cream skimming for any country should not be doing. I think every country should play its part in this process of negotiation.
Perhaps we should talk about the LDC package. What people don't know here, and I'd like to, because without going into the translation bit of it, that Japan has given perhaps the best package to the least developed countries. They offered this 6 months ago. It's been the package with the biggest mass in it to LDC countries. Japan has done that already.
Specific products, you want to cover the products that you're talking about?
For LDC countries, the package, the package which Japan has given already. So they put that on the table. Not rice, but for LDC countries.
Well, I think the other thing that we often forget in the debate, and I'm sure it's the truth in Japan and it's the case in Europe, that consumers are still paying quite a high price for the protection of rice and beef and vegetables and the like. You'd agree with that, Mr. Amari, that the cost of these goods in Japan are probably much higher than the market forces would dictate internationally.
Well, about the duty-free, quota-free treatment of the goods coming from LDCs, I think the percentage would be elevated from 86% to 98% by offering this package. Well, Japan is the biggest importer of food in the world, and at the same time, we have to think about food security in our country. So there are areas that we have to protect, and I think it's true for any country participating in the negotiation. So this is the position that I would like to continue to maintain. But other than these, in the agriculture area and in other areas, I can say that we can think of reducing the average value. I'm not in a position to give you the specific number. It's up to the agriculture minister that he is going to answer this question. He is here in Davos. Minister Matsuoka should have been invited to this panel discussion. Japan is ready to make concessions, but I'm not in a position to show our cards in front of you, because then we would not be able to engage in the negotiation effectively.
We knew that game in Washington as passed the hot potato to the other minister. Is he ready to jump in? No. We have some questions to take, but thank you for the analysis on that. We had a question here, if you can stand up. Thanks.
Geneva and the Chief WTO accession negotiator from Kazakhstan. My question will be about the perspective of acceding countries to WTO. My question is how these developing countries dimensions or countries in transition dimensions are being taken into account by key WTO founding members in the accession negotiations. Because our experience so far, which is shared among many acceding countries, are that the commitments which are being asked to undertake upon accession sometimes go far beyond the commitments which have been undertaken by the founding members of WTO on such issues such as energy or Mode 4 or agricultural subsidy. And for the country like Kazakhstan, of course, we have now more resources coming to the economy, so we'll be able to support 40% of population living in rural areas in agriculture, while we are being asked to take the base periods which is a recent one and not necessarily reflecting our long-term needs for agriculture sector development in the accession negotiations. Okay. And my question is whether there is any kind of a position, official position, on the part of these key WTO members towards acceding countries and how their development perspectives or development needs are being taken into account in these negotiations. Good. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Pascal?
Well, I think you are right. Many developing countries, and especially least developed countries, who are negotiating their accessions, are taking commitments which founding members did not take 50 years ago. But that's history. And there is no such thing as a standard price to join WTO. It's a negotiation. You negotiate your entry ticket with the members of the club, and they determine the price of the entry ticket according to their views. That's half of the negotiation. The other half of the negotiation is this sort of X-raying of your economic system, legislation, regulations, to make sure that there it matches WTO standards. Now, this happens. It's perfectly doable. Cambodia, who's an LDC, acceded some years ago. Vietnam, who's not an LDC, is acceded a few weeks ago. Others are very near to accession in the pipeline. What is key is that existing members, and notably the big ones, who sort of set the benchmark for the accession price, EU, US, India, Brazil, China, now, understand that LDCs should not be arm-twisted, and that the key for a successful accession, and we've seen that, for instance, with China, which is the sort of most formidable accession negotiation which took place, the key is finding the right synergy between domestic reform process and the terms of accession. Terms of accession have to be what developing countries can accept to do in terms of reform. Not more, because that would derail and usually antagonize constituencies, which then, once you're a member of WTO, sort of try to say for the revenge. Not less, because that's the right quantum. And in the case of Kazakhstan, you can be sure that when the time comes, if the people in the Secretariat have the feeling that there is a bit too much which is asked, we will reverberate this to the members. Now, we don't decide, they decide, but this sort of sense of measurement, I can grant you, will be there.
Good.
Pascal, you mentioned India. I could speak for myself, and I'd like to tell you that India would agree to Kazakhstan's accession immediately when you want it, and I could speak for Brazil too.
On the condition you let them buy at least 2 or 3 oil companies, the wells up in Kashagan field you'd like to have particular access to.
That's not what I'm going to share with you.
We got a question from over here.
Martin Wolf, Financial Times. This is a question for Ambassador Schwab. Have the results of the congressional elections, results of the congressional elections mean that the US now requires labour standards or some other similar change in order to renew fast track and above all to ratify the round?
As you know, the discussion over labour standards and environmental standards has arisen not in the context of the multilateral round, but rather in the context of bilateral free trade agreements. And that really has been the scope of the dialogue, of the conversation. I think the change in control of the Congress, while it makes the process more interesting, I don't think it makes it any more difficult or any easier. I think that there is goodwill on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol. And we have been in a dialogue with the new Democratic leadership, the new Republican ranking members on key committees to see what kind of accommodations may be possible without sacrificing principle when it comes to labor issues, when it comes to environmental issues. In terms of Fast Track Trade Promotion Authority, the focus there, to the extent it is on labor and environment, is more likely to be on the bilateral side. In terms of the multilateral undertaking, I think there's a recognition, the Doha round, the framework, the declaration, this negotiation has been in process for 5 or 6 years. You can't just reopen that. That said, there's a genuine interest there, and there's a dialogue that will take place, and we'll see what happens.
Just a quick follow-up, if I may. The head of the Agriculture Committee in the House is a Democrat, of course, with the change of power, from Minnesota, who said basically that the last farm package was about $20 billion in subsidies, and he does not see any reason to go below it, and the negotiations are underway now. But these are the political realities you have to go back to in Washington and say, look, I'm at the table, I'm trying to give our fair share. The President supports me, but can you get it through that sort of Congress?
I think the potential, again, this goes to a question of a breakthrough lending some traction to the Trade Promotion Authority fast-track process. If there are constituencies out there that see the potential for new trade flows, for the development impact of the round, there's going to be a constituency for fast-track and for the Doha round.
Okay, I just have one final question, then I'll let the group answer very shortly. Prime Minister Blair said it was, quote, more likely than not, unquote, that we can get a deal in the next 3 to 4 months. President Lula said he was very positive and predicted a deal within the next 3 to 4 months. Does everybody share that opinion before we wrap it up today? Who wants to weigh in?
I obviously share that view. I mean, otherwise, you'll have to pay my ticket to somewhere else. But and that's not included.
It wasn't by accident. I looked at the fine gentleman from Brazil first. No,
but since you asked, since you look at me, let me say one thing, which I think it's really a point for analysis, and it's for deep thought among all of us. And I think that relates to what Susan has just said, because I think we all have been working in goodwill and trying to find a solution for these questions. And of course, she says to us, and I think it's natural because of the congressional constraints and demands, that she has to have a good package in order that she can come to a good figure and good disciplines in the area of domestic subsidies. And of course, most of the others say that, well, we need to have an attractive offer, more attractive than the one of October 2005 in terms of domestic support, so that we can make a move. I'm not saying that to criticize one or the other side, but this question of what comes first is one of the most difficult questions that Pascal has to deal with, and only he can deal with, because only he, talking discreetly to everyone, can see where we can get. Because I think this is really a crucial question. Just an analysis. That's not what you asked me, but I thought I should offer
Peter,
it.
and then we'll go to Pascal.
Well, John, you know that Tony Blair is just one more Prime Minister from one of our member states in the European Union. He doesn't mean anything more or less to me than that. He's entitled to his view. Seriously speaking. Look, in the coming, 2 months or more or so, I think it'll be about 2 months, all the negotiators that you see before you are going to have to arrive at a very, very difficult judgment indeed about whether we have negotiated as far as we can go to get enough on the table to cross that threshold which is necessary for success to finish the round. Or does it fall below that threshold, which means that we will not have all of us, as different negotiators, sufficient to take back to and please and win the support of our different constituencies for the outcome of this round. But equally, the judgment will also involve not simply the threshold below which we can't fall for success, but a judgment about the risk of trying to go so far above that threshold that we overbid and commit ourselves to failure. And I think that, there are going to be so many different political factors as well as our desire as individual negotiators to be able to come out of this and to demonstrate that we've done the best possible job. We don't want to be, condemned by our own people as negotiators who have fallen short of what we could otherwise achieve. So there's going to be a whole mix of different factors. I think the danger for us will be during this period, and we're now in the end game. Either way, this is going to end in success or failure in the next sort of 2 to 3 months, in my view. Partly for political reasons, chiefly but not only in the United States, and also because of the negotiating fatigue that is setting in amongst many. But I think the danger will be that as we go on, some will think that if we wait a bit longer and negotiate a bit further and demand a little bit more and wait for a little bit more of what we can extract to bring home for our constituencies, that in a sense we're waiting for something better to come along. And I think that there will reach a moment, therefore, that we will have to realise that the something else that is going to come along is not something better, but no deal at all. That there will come a point where we feel that we've reached the finishing point of this negotiation, and if we push it any further, it won't be something better that comes along, but nothing at all. And in that sense, we are in great danger, could be in great danger, of falling into the classical trap of making what's perfect the enemy of what's good. I have no doubt at all that, given what's on the table already, but also what I foresee we will be able to add to the table in the coming month or more, that this round is already worth more than any previous multilateral round in history. It's certainly, by common consent, worth 2 to 3 times more than the previous Uruguay round. And therefore, through some misstep or miscalculation or misjudgment, allow what is in our grasp to slip away would be a terrible accident to allow to happen. We would not only lose the enormous economic value and benefit of a successful outcome of this round, something which most people accept is worth hundreds of billions of dollars of trade and increased prosperity a year during the implementation of this period, of this round, should we finish it successfully. But more equally important as the economic value from the round, in my view, is the systemic consequences of failure, of failing to put in place a much-needed insurance policy that the global economy needs against increased protectionism and isolationism in the world, which would have huge consequences for all of us, but particularly for the developing countries in this world.
Thank you for that. We are well over time, so I'm going to ask Mr. Amari if you can give it to me, a final summary in 30 seconds, and then I think I should come to you. Thanks.
As the advice was given to us by DG Lamy, and we have engaged vigorously in bilateral discussions and consultations so far, and I think it is important to close the gap of the positions on a bilateral basis, and if there are gaps, then we will never be able to succeed. So if 2 countries and some other countries get together to close down or narrow down the gap then I think we can lead to the overall successful negotiation. So in that sense, I think major countries and other countries should promote bilateral negotiations and consultants. And a question was raised, what can we do for developing countries? And I would like to assure you that we have something ready to put on the table, but other countries have not shown any cards on the table. And if Japan should do that, then I think that should be taken, and then we would find it even more difficult to convince the Japanese constituency. If other peoples would put their cards, we are willing to put our cards on the table too. Another point is the One Village, One Product initiative that we have been engaging. In other words, we are helping developing countries to identify good, promising products and to help them market their products in the international market. We are providing capacity building, and we are trying to focus and identify the promising products and give them advice and give them some capacity building so that their local and domestic products can display at the Japanese international airports. And we are trying to spread this internationally as an international version of One Village, One Product, so that these developing countries can promote the export of these countries. This is the initiative that we have been promoting. So I think we're making a lot of contribution to the round ourselves.
Pascal, just a final word because of time. Thanks.
Yeah. To be short, going back to my aviation analogy, it's obviously much more difficult to land a plane with smog than with clear weather. What the big chiefs have said to their negotiators is, we've cleared the weather for you. Now, do your numbers, not any number. They all have a range of numbers which have to respect, a sort of minimum or a maximum, depending whether you have to get or pay. A few $1 billion question is, now the weather is clear, are these ranges of number compatible? If they are compatible, there is a landing zone. We just have to find it by approximation. If they're not compatible, they won't get there. And the next weeks are going to be about these tests of whether the range of numbers which each of the negotiators here has from his boss, from his constituency, can converge. My own sense is that it should be possible, but only they decide.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate everybody staying in for an extra 10 minutes of the questions because of the nature of the negotiations and the attention paid to them. I thought it was worth the extra 10. We started 5 minutes late, so thanks for the extra time, and I want to thank the distinguished panelists for answering all the questions.